organizations.
Yeah.
Just to go a little louder.
Yeah. Okay. One. I'm proud to affirm the resolution that the United States federal government should normalize diplomatic relations with the Taliban government of Afghanistan. So we have plan text, which is essentially to do the resolution, right? To normalize diplomatic relations through a couple mechanisms. So one, we tell you that we're going to be establishing a permanent diplomatic presence in Kabul. So two, we will establish formal intelligence sharing with the Taliban to combat ISIS-K, and I'll get to that more in my first advantage. And then three, in return, the Taliban must meet benchmarks such as restricting the operational space of Al-Qaeda, and B, allowing the safe operation of NGOs to ensure humanitarian aid reaches vulnerable populations. Our method of implementation will be normal ways and means. Our funding will be as needed. Our time will be to enact for 90 days, and the act will be the United States federal government. Our way mechanism will be net benefits. And do you guys have any questions about our plan? Anything?
Any and all questions to ask
specificity?
right now.
Yeah, POC then. Can we get the text of your plan?
Yes. Okay. Time, 3, 2, 1. So our first advantage is counterterrorism. Our uniqueness here is one. ISIS-K is a counter-terror organization of the Taliban and poses the most direct threat to international interests. So A, they target embassies more than the Taliban. An example of this was just recently they attacked the Pakistani and Russian embassies and Chinese nationalist hotels all throughout Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan. B, they view the Taliban as too moderate and they are ultra radical. So C, they aim to support them. So D, they target minorities like the Hazaras. And E, it leads to an increase in regional deaths. We tell you that they uniquely attack minorities and that they aim to destabilize the region. So two, the Taliban can't dismantle ISIS-K alone. So A, they have been having trouble with the clandestine cells. They've lost track because they as in ISIS-K, like many terrorist groups, move throughout urban areas using them as cover. An example of this is similar to Hamas. And so three, ISIS-K is worse than the Taliban for a couple of reasons too. So A, they have an apocalyptic agenda. So Taliban, their entire motto is right, like death to America. Their goal, they have very separate goals. They tell you that ISIS-K is incredibly different. They seek world destruction and chaos. So B, ISIS-K views anyone who does not share the same ultra-radical beliefs as subhuman. They specifically target soft civilian targets, including the Shia mosques, girls' schools, and hospitals. So the links here are one, the plan passes and we increase intelligence sharing. Two, the Taliban is better able to predict ISIS-K's attacks. A, that decreases the killings of minorities because we think that the Taliban is actually one stabilizing the region currently. And we think that three, the Taliban really hates ISIS-K and are thus more likely to meet the U.S. demands. Again, the ones that I've already mentioned are decreasing operation and Al-Qaeda. That's probably good as a whole because that means there's less human rights violations. And then two, we also tell you that's going to lead to the second portion of our plan, which was to allow safe operations of NGOs. I'll take that down as intention and increase humanitarian aid. And that's probably going to be also good for vulnerable populations. The impacts of this, our fourth point here is also a diplomatic presence will lead to an increase of on-the-ground surveillance of the Taliban themselves, which is probably an benefit as well for the United States because the Taliban themselves are still a threat, even though we tell you that ISIS is far worse. And five, we tell you that this prevents further fragmentation. The Afghanistan fragmentation is occurring in the status quo as it's already proven because of ISIS-K versus Afghanistan. And we tell you that it's harder to hide when the surveillance is increased, and thus we tell you that there's less fragmentation and probably more stability in the region. So the impacts here are one, less death. We think that death probably outweighs everything else. And then we think that by increasing diplomatic presence, by increasing intelligence sharing, there's less killings of the most disadvantaged populations, such as the minorities I've already mentioned, those in Shia mosques, those with the Hazaras. Okay. So our second advantage here is going to be on humanitarian access. And then do you think this here is one? Oh yeah, if you want.
So if they don't agree to your demands, will you still go through with the positive parts? Like, will the U.S. still recognize them even if they don't agree with them?
No, I think we feel that the demands have to be. Okay. So advantage two, it's like on contingency, and we don't recognize them as a government. That's not part of the plan. No, we're not recognizing them as a government. Okay. So advantage two is humanitarian access. The uniqueness here is one, humanitarian access is bad in Afghanistan and the status quo. Before warrants for this. A, food security. Over 1/3 of the population faced crisis level food insecurity in the 25 to 26 season. B, women's rights. Women and girls can't afford free movement, education, or employment. There's also massive gender violence, like this primarily comes from also ISIS-K. And then C, economic collapse. Basically, everyone is really poor. There's a real poverty issue. The financial system has collapsed too. D, the healthcare system is really poor. Hospitals keep closing, etc. So two, U.S. diplomatic relations are key to helping this crisis. There's three mechanisms that can do this true. A, international awareness. It brings out of state awareness to the Afghanistan situation. And then B, it's safe access into zones. It provides negotiation for humanitarian corridors and periods of peace for humanitarian workers to get through. C, targeted leverage. It gives the U.S. a mechanism through which to use all the leverage we have. 3, the U.S. has significant leverage over Afghanistan that makes it conducive to intense diplomatic relations. So A, the U.S. controls the ability to recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government of Afghanistan. That's a major bargaining chip, though we tell you that in our plan we're not necessarily doing so. B, the U.S. holds billions of dollars of Afghan central bank assets, so it has massive economic leverage too. The Afghanistan GDP is about 15 billion, so again, can be at 7 billion. So C, prisoners, the U.S. holds thousands of Taliban prisoners, which it uses for another form of bargaining leverage. So links here: 1, the plan passes and diplomatic relations open up. 2, Afghanistan economic collapse is prevented. 3 mechanisms here. A, the Taliban external funding. The status quo, they rely on taxes and mining, but resources are running out both financially and geographically. The U.S. diplomacy unlocks a potential $7 billion, which is key to future stability. B, banking sector support. The U.S. gives support to stability to the banking system via expertise, etc., which is key to financial stability in the long term. And then C, development. It helps developmental infrastructure for increased development. Also, again, we've proven to you through our uniqueness that there's probably going to be an increased chance that they meet our demands for the incentives that we've given you, and that also provides. And then based off our plan, we tell you that's probably going to lead to a quality of life change for the citizens, because we think that's going to because that per again our plan, that means that we are going to allow NGOs to have safe operation and thus increase humanitarian access. And then 3, we tell you limiting growth are probably going to be have a higher quality of life as well because of the humanitarian aid here. Okay, and then so back to the top of case. Sorry, the impacts here are 1, quality of life, 2, death, because we tell you that we're going to be decreasing the dehumanization of people. We tell you that B, specifically the safe access into zones, because we think that that's going to increase spaces where people can actually exist, mainly that's probably going to lead to quality of life. Benefit, we tell you that the targeted leverage means that you're probably going to get access to the Taliban being better able to predict ISIS-K, and then for that reason, you're probably going to have less human rights violations there, and then also being more likely to meet U.S. demands because of the U.S. leverage is key, because that leads to less human rights violations.
Wait.
Do you want the random details of that?
So, you can shorthand it though.
So, before I begin, quick trigger warning. There's non-graphic descriptions of sexual assault. Is anybody uncomfortable with that? Perfect. Oh yeah, we'll wait for this. You're fine. Close. Too often case. Is anybody not ready? First off, interpretation, the 1AC or PMC must not specify utilitarianism or net benefits as the weighing mechanism to debate under. The violation is the 1AC uses utilitarianism or they specify as net benefits. Reject any we meets. We oppose the 1AC framing and use of net benefits even if they come up with any semantical we meets, the standards. First is on ableism. Utilitarianism expels individuals who can't experience pleasure and pain out of the moral community, like individuals with anhedonia or CIP, which is unsafe because it means their lives have no value under util. This triggers skepticism. Even if one actor is excluded from utilitarianism, you have to negate their framework isn't normative and can't explain every single moral agent. There's no moral obligation to affirm, which means you ought to negate. The second is on the principle. Utilitarianism cannot justify intrinsic wrongness. It's based on consequences. Things like SA would be morally obligatory under utilitarianism if it maximizes pleasure. Probability doesn't solve that, allows for moral error and freezes action while attempting to calculate the perfect decision. This kills in-round safety. This is the internal link to fairness because you can't have any in-round fairness if you feel unsafe. The third is on moral repugnancy. Util justifies atrocities. It allows us to harm some to benefit others. A peeping Tom, for instance, proves it becomes obligatory for the peeping Tom to spy on a person without their consent, since it maximizes pleasure and creates no pain, even though we can intuitively identify that that thing is wrong and it makes the debate space unsafe. The fourth is resolvability. Utilitarianism fails, which makes debate irresolvable. This is an independent reason to reject the affirmative for wasting our time, or it also triggers permissibility. You have to vote negative. The subpoint A is on aggregation. It's impossible. You can't quantify different amounts of pain. For example, you can't quantify the difference between a headache or a wound. You can't compare between them. Subpoint B is predictions are impossible. The butterfly effect means you cannot consider stable consequences. I can drop this pen right now and nuclear war might happen in 10 years, but insofar as you need consequences in order to establish the utility of an action, then you cannot make that conclusion. The subpoint C is justifying predictions is circular. Past trends don't guarantee future outcomes. The assumption that they do relies on experience, but experience itself depends on the same flawed logic. The sun could explode tomorrow. We have no idea. The subpoint D is time discounting. Does one life now equal 1 or 2 lives a decade from now? It's impossible to resolve this issue. But the fifth standard is on laziness. Parley teams avoid meaningful and complex framework debate by copying out with utilitarianism. We need a norm set. Voting down teams using utilitarianism or net benefits forces them to explore other philosophical frameworks like Kantianism. The impact here is philosophical diversity. The most important form of education is philosophical education, since it begs the question of what actually matters in the first place and what our values are as people, the voters. What is unfairness? Our opponents make this round unsafe and inaccessible. These rounds are the worst form of unfairness because since engagement is physically impossible, unfairness use evaluation and is a meta constraint on truth. You can't truth test any other arguments besides if you don't resolve the fairness question first. Second is on permissibility. If utilitarianism fails, then affirmative cannot generate a moral obligation that justifies affirming. This means you auto-negate independent of theory because the affirmative has the burden of proof in this round. Subpoint A is on semantics. The word should is defined as expressing obligation via the Oxford Dictionary. Absent a proactive obligation, when utilitarianism fails, you have to vote negative by default. The subpoint B is on default states. We have to assume statements are false until proven true. Like, I'm the best debater in the world. I have to prove that to you. You can't immediately assume that that's true. You have to have positive proof to justify a statement. The third voter here is education. Schools defund debate without it, and debate collapses. Cross-apply that philosophical education is the most important kind. The underview. First, the implication is drop the debater. It norm sets and ensures that debate remains a safe space for all. The judge has a proximal obligation to ensure inaccessible practices don't proliferate. The representations here are binding. The 1AC's discourse is irreversible. They've already shaped our assumptions about the rest of the round and also about the world. The second is competing interpretations over reasonability. Reasonability is inherently arbitrary and collapses the competing interpretations anyway. The third is no RBIs. RBIs justify theory baiting and create a chilling effect on theory, which means abuse proliferates. Because if you can't run theory, then you can't check back against an abusive plan, for instance. Fourth, theory comes a priori. You have to set the rules of the game before you play it. Fifth is that reject all empty theory. The affirmative can read multiple standards and collapse to one and read unreciprocated golden turns on block defense in their last speech. The subpoint A here is the implication. Evaluate empty theory at end of the block. There's an 8-minute under this model of debate. There's an 8-minute MG which responds to the LOC theory. There's an 8-minute MO that responds to the AF theory. Don't give them the extra 5 minutes in the PMR to generate new responses. The subpoint B is that you grant RBIs on empty theory. The subpoint C is goldenrod. Make the PMR win every single standard and counter standard to disallow single standard collapse, which is a horrible model of debate because that means negative can never win. The subpoint D is LOC over empty theory. The first reason is real world education. Courts evaluate this way. The second is ordered abuse. The negative can be unfair in response to affirmative unfairness. Third is magnitude. The LOC index the rest of the round. It outweighs on magnitude. On the plan. Okay. On the plan text itself, it normalizes.
Normalize needs to recognize the state.
It's fine. The disadvantage is structural violence and uniqueness. 1, Afghanistan under the Taliban is terrible for women and minorities. The subpoint A's legal code says women have no voice. The subpoint B is there's a total ban on education for girls. The subpoint C is that there's mandatory male guardian requirement for all travel. The subpoint D is there are targeted extrajudicial killings of the Hazaras ethnic group. The second is accountability is coming. The subpoint A in 2025, the ICC pretrial chamber 2 issued warrants for the Taliban supreme leader for gender persecution as a crime against humanity. Subpoint B, in 2025, the UN Human Rights Council established an independent investigative group to secure evidence for future prosecution. The third point is that humanitarian aid currently bypasses the regime through parallel channels. The subpoint A is that UN agencies and NGOs provide services to 22 million people. The links. One is that recognition is unconditional legitimation. The subpoint A is that it removes leaders from the FBI watch list. The subpoint B is when Russia was recognized in 2025, the Taliban when Russia recognized the Taliban in 2025, the Taliban barred all women from UN compounds and enacted extreme vice and virtue laws, creating a stable caste hierarchy. The second is that recognition collapses parallel aid and kills accountability. Subpoint A, under the Vienna Convention, recognized states can refuse aid for being routed through them. Subpoint B is that ICC warrants are impossible to enforce. The impacts. One is structural violence. Subpoint A, gender apartheid becomes permanent in Afghanistan. The subpoint B, aid is captured and used by the state as a lever over citizens. The subpoint C is there are more killings and entrenched discrimination. Structural violence comes first. First, it destroys the value of life by robbing people of agency. The second is that it's passed down generationally. This is a generational issue that must be passed down to that creates compounding violence over time. The third is that there's a 100% probability that these structures kill people. The subpoint A is focusing on 1% nuclear war scenarios or these high magnitude impacts locks us into imagining threats and taking preventative efforts, which makes more conflict. The subpoint B is we can't solve extinction threats out of ground, but we can solve issues of structural violence by trying to advocate for them inside of ground. On their case. On the first advantage, I think there's a major turn here. Counterterrorism begets more terrorism. 3 reasons. First is on splintering. When you decapitate terrorist leaders, that splinters terrorist groups and makes them harder to find. They retreat into the countryside, which means any amount of counter-terrorist action is met with more splintering and therefore more retaliation against those who are trying to attack the terrorists. The second is on weapons spillover. A UN study found U.S. weapons following the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan within the Taliban's own stock, which means that when you have weapons lying around in the Middle East because of all these counter-terrorist measures, these weapons go into the terrorist groups themselves, and that enables them to become more violent and use those weapons for bad things. The third is on martyrdom. When you kill the leaders of terrorist groups, for example, ISIS-K, you create a martyr, which means the rest of the terrorist groups take after that martyr and feel more incentive to retaliate against the force that took that martyr from them. On the second advantage, first, they stated it themselves. The Taliban hates the United States. Why would they change their already sexist policies if they're not contingent upon? I guess they're. Whatever. I guess the major turn here is that there's going to be public backlash in the United States. The U.S. would not send humanitarian aid to Afghanistan if they thought that our taxpayer dollars are going towards the food and security of Taliban people who are subjugating women, for instance. And in the U.S. and other Western countries, which value things like agency and things like the equality between genders, that means that public backlash turns this entire contention because you're never actually able to get humanitarian aid.
Collapsing parallel structure.
Collapsing parallel structures. Yeah. Can I have your?
Yeah.
I guess since I have time, I'm gonna go on the top. On the top, normal means to recognize what? Normalize means to recognize them as a state, so they aren't topical in this round. They can't win this round because they're not being topical to debate. And also, the Taliban might not do this. There's no guarantee. Meaning the plan may not happen, so you have to negate there. They can't fiat this, or they could fiat that the Taliban stops being bad in Ottawa. Thanks.
Yo, guys.
Okay, order is the inter, the decide, the 2 advantages of order. Okay, sorry, actually, inter, decide, the weird flip on top of case, the 2 advantages of order. Great.
Sorry, what was that again?
Inter, decide, weird blip on top of case, 2 advantages of order. Are we ready?
Yeah.
Great. Time starts in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to start by lining the standards. Their first standard is on ableism. No value in life is an independent IVI for the affirmation side, at the point at which the assumption that anyone can have no value to your life is an independently Nazi ideology. We're not ever going to affirm, we will never affirm anyone having no value to your life. At that point, an IVI is an independent concern because excuses out of the round makes it impossible for us to debate. Probably means you can drop them independently on the ideology that anyone can have no value to your life. We will never affirm that. We refuse to. But the second standard, they talk about the principle. We can probably tell you that objectivity is also going to outweigh fairness because objectivity is a prerequisite to fairness. E.g., utilitarianism offers an objective way to calculate impacts. Probably means that under other ethical frameworks, you're always going to have less objective ways to calculate impacts. They probably tell you that if you don't have an objective ethical foundation, probably means that you're never actually going to be able to calculate fairness. But then the third thing is the morally bad system keeping calm. We'll probably tell you that they don't provide any other alternatives. Probably means that you default to util as the only framework. But then also we tell you there's probably flaws in all moral frameworks to the point at which even Dion will justify lying, will justify telling the truth and letting someone serially kill your friend. Okay, fourth standard is about how resolving is always failing. But we tell you it's probably the point of debate. Our argument is even if you don't know at the very beginning of the debate which action is ethical under util, it's probably the whole point of the debate. It's to gauge the impacts and then weigh them against each other. That's why we're debating. This is not an issue to be had against utilitarianism. This is a flaw within the utilitarian framework that we should probably be debating out anyways. And they talk about aggregation. I think this is probably just another debate to be had within the utilitarian framework. We can measure the levels of happiness we get from dopamine and serotonin, weigh them against each other to tell which actually makes us happiness. But then the fifth is that predictions are impossible. We probably tell you that we make predictions all the time. They made a prediction about how we would respond to this. They probably have some watch right now. They also probably had this shell right now, they had an arm wrestle off their head. That's a prediction that this would be strategically good to them. All of us probably make predictions all the time. It's just a silly argument. This last is called laziness. You can probably turn the standards. Probably probably better if we debate about different impacts. That is to say, if they propose a deontological framework and we propose a utilitarian framework, we probably turn the standard, we probably get more philosophical education if we're able to compare the two frameworks, like critically engage with meta-weighting comparative between the two frameworks, probably means you can turn the standard. But then you can go to their voters, their first voters on fairness, probably they don't have standards, like it doesn't work. But then also they say they trigger permissibility, but you can probably buy that as close after the point at which they literally read like an intro. We also tell you that the intro is a form of advocacy, probably means that presumption plus app. But then we also probably tell you that burden of proof plus app. Then we also probably tell you that the block's really broken, 12 minutes consecutive speaking time. There's some study that proves continuous speaking time is better than having the last word. Probably means that when you have 12 minutes continuous speaking time, it's probably even worse. Thanks, Vesta. They also talk about how default states, well, we'd probably say that there's an equal amount of statements that are proven right and proven wrong. Probably means that you can say this statement is true, you can also say that this statement is not true. That means you're negating the not of that statement. That means there's an equal number of statements that are correct and false. Yeah.
Do you immediately assume a statement to be true then?
You don't immediately assume a statement to be either. You don't have an assumption about the statement. That's why we do debate. That's the whole point. Yeah. Okay. Okay, they say drop the debate approach. Argue this is probably antithetical to the rest of their shell of the point, which we're probably going to get more education out of the round and more critical more philosophical education if you just drop the argument instead, because then you can actually critically engage, critically compare the two frameworks. Probably means that if they're going to get rid of util, we can read a deontological, they can read a deontological framework. If you drop our argument of net benefits, which debate under whatever ethical framework they're going to propose, probably means that you can just drop the argument of net benefits will still win. But they talk about competing interest servers. I'll read the counter for a moment. They say no RBIs. Probably two reasons to prefer RBIs. One, it's reciprocity. Probably it means that they can get terminal offense on the top layer of the vote. You should probably be able to get terminal offense off of that layer too. Also, just not how RBIs work. RBIs, if you win the theory, you win the debate. If you lose the theory, you lose the debate. It probably means that we should be able to have bidirectional offense. Means that if we win the shell, we should win the debate. But it doesn't deter all theory. It only deters bad theory. This is good theory. You should probably be able to win it. But then also they talk about how they give you a bunch of underview arguments. Most of them are probably going to be really unimportant. We're not reading empty theories, whatever. But also they forgot a speech. They skip from MO to PMR. That's pretty funny. They also talk about the golden rod a lot. We probably tell you the golden rod is a broken argument, because it's probably arguments on both sides as to why we should why one side is harder than the other. If there's competing difficulty claims, you can probably just watch them. We also tell you dropping a standard is sufficient grounds for us to lose the debate. That's what we say. If you drop one link, you should lose. It's probably not an actual argument. And they also say LC theory over empty theory. Sure, whatever. We're not reading theory. Okay. Counter-return. The app may read any post-fiat framework they wish. Standards. 1. Education. Teaches us to read many frameworks. Gives debaters agency to choose. As people, we need to learn our own moral frameworks. Also not restricting one single framework off probably gives us the ability to choose between multiple frameworks. Then also second counter-inter. The app may set the weighing mechanism to net benefits. Accessibility. That means more accessibility because a lot of teams are able to do this. You can probably weigh our counter-returns against theirs. They're probably better. You probably pick some on the shelf. Oh yeah, there's more. Okay. Also we did in another in a different round. We didn't read the framework of net benefits. They don't specify it has to be in this round. We need to show. Okay, first, this out of structural violence. All their uniqueness is backwards to the point at which they're actually advocating the status quo. Probably means that all the humanitarian aid things they mean are just bad impacts on their side. Okay, their third part about humanitarian aid. They talk about how the humanitarian is able to bypass the regime of the status quo. Two responses here. One, we're advocating for more NGOs, and probably stops. But then also we tell you attacks. The Taliban, the government right now is attacking humanitarian aid. If we negotiate with them, we can probably get them to stop attacking humanitarian aid. That is to say, the government itself is mitigating the effectiveness of humanitarian aid in the status quo. It's probably going to be really bad. From the links, they say the recognition is really, really bad, but the point which we're literally not recognizing, I'll get to that in a moment, they don't get access to any of their impacts. But also their impacts, they say state violence is permanent. We probably tell you that aid capture is going to happen in their world a lot, and also is happening in their world. Probably means we don't get all the aid captured in our world. Both sides have aid captured to some extent. The question is to what extent you're going to be able to protect the aid. That's what happens in our world, the point at which we get more involved in Afghanistan. Okay, they give you a 10-second blip in topical case. You're not going to be voting off this 10-second blip. It's literally the semifinals of TOC. What the heck, guys? But then also they say we're not topical because we don't actually affirm the entire resolution because we're not recognized in the state. We don't actually need to recognize in the state. They look to what the resolution actually says. It simply says normalize diplomatic relations with the Taliban government of Afghanistan. That doesn't mean we actually need to recognize in the state at the point at which it doesn't actually say that the state is becoming the Taliban. I don't know. It's not the resolution. You can just read the resolution. But then also we probably tell you you can't just drop us from that. Okay, they need to implicate it now. They need to read an intro. They need to do a lot more work here, actually convince you to drop us on that. Okay, on our first advantage about counterterrorism, they give you a 3-point turn here. They say it leads to splintering, but we're probably going to tell you that splintering is not unique in the point at which we already tell you that there's probably counterterrorism efforts happening in the status quo. That probably means that the delta here is the effectiveness of counterterrorism efforts. That is to say even if the Afghanistan other governments in that area probably don't want these terrorist groups in the status quo, that means that they're probably going to if they don't want them there in the status quo, they're fighting them off. Probably means that counterterrorism is not unique. The difference is the effectiveness of counterterrorism. The U.S. diplomacy allows us to be more effectively counter-terrorist. But then also they talk about the weapon spillover. We tell you there's empirically a billion examples of when U.S. military aid has been effective. Just because military aid could spill over to some place spillover, it's not sufficient grounds to like not give any weapons at all. That's like don't let the good be the enemy of the perfect, I think. And then the third argument is on martyrdom, deterrent martyrdom, because we probably think that like martyrdom it creates a deterrent effect. Because when you see like one of your leaders is like you see as like the most powerful person ever like gets killed, you probably don't want to join the movement because you're gonna die. It's really really bad. Or like that's good. I think it's really bad. Okay, second advantage about humanitarian access, which is really, really important. They say that they literally just say one response, so they say turn because there's like U.S. backlash. But the point of which two responses here. One, we're fiating this, like we get fiat power on like actually having the plan passed. But then also we think that we're probably going to be doing this through like embassies and like diplomacy. Like we're like enlisting diplomats to like send to Afghanistan. It's probably going to be really, really good because the point of which like these diplomats like their entire job is like aid. Like we can probably buy that they're going to want to increase their black relations. They probably also have like a vested interest in solving for the harms of the status quo. The point of which we reach like 7 really, really bad things that are happening right now. We probably buy that like even though Afghanistan hates the United States, we still control like literally half of their GDP's worth of money in our banks. They probably are literally forced to listen to us because we control half of their GDP. Probably means that we have a ton of diplomatic leverage over them. For all these reasons, you're always affirming.
Okay. That was fun. All right, I'm going to go through probably, we'll go through the theory, the counterinterps that we need. Then we'll go onto the plan, and then we'll go through our disad, then yours.
Wait, sorry, just give me a second here.
Yeah.
Can you repeat it?
Sure. Okay, so theory,
Great.
the counterinterps, whatnot. Then the plan, your plan, and then the disad, and then case and order. My time begins. 3, 2, 1. Now, extend the interpretation. Again, they must specify something other than net benefits. Again, we are objecting to their specific mention of net benefits in this round. Again, my partner explains that we needs that are semantical aren't going to fly. That means that the we need about specifying in a different round doesn't make any sense. But even if you don't buy that, you can buy the spirit over text is the only way you can evaluate this sort of interp. Or else they could always have an out, and you can never run actual theory because they could specify in their head or in a different universe or any of these arguments make it impossible for us to ever win the theory round, which means that they're always allowed to be infinitely abusive, which again is a fairness argument. So you have to look to spirit. If they violate any of our standards, then they're violating the shell. All right, extend the laziness standard. Extend it. Parley teams always read the same thing. They make no argument against this. Again, Parley teams always read net benefits. That means they're not actually gaining any sort of education. They claim the only argument here is that debating frameworks is better. But again, we offer a counter framework really, but they just don't engage with it at all. Also, we think that if the app always I mean, like a counter framework is in like structural violence. We don't have to. Yeah. Also, not our interest.
This should be
correct. All right. Did you agree? 2, 1. Now, insofar as we're marginally better when the app provides a different moral framework, because now we're debating between two other all right. Under their model of debate, you're always debating between util and some other framework, right? Under our model, you get other frameworks versus other frameworks. That's an infinitely larger number of different permutations, which means we're always getting more education because there are more frameworks to compare, and thus there are more permutations between the frameworks. That means we're always winning on the number of the amount of education that you're garnering. Okay, yeah, you can extend that. Again, we're winning on education because just if you have more frameworks, you're getting more education. Extend resolvability. Again, util fails. They drop the justifying predictions as circular argument and the time discounting argument. Again, their only response to the predictions argument is we make predictions all the time. That doesn't mean that those predictions are good, but also time discounting means that you can't evaluate whether one life now is worth 5 lives in the future, or the inverse is true. We have no ability to judge these things. They give no response to how we can actually measure this sort of thing. Measuring brain chemicals doesn't make any sense in this sort of time-weighted manner. So again, you're buying that util fails, which means that their model of debate always leads to the round being unadjudicatable because you're unable to evaluate anything. This is a prerequisite to being able to garner education from the round, because if you can't adjudicate anything, you can't provide educational feedback. It's also unfair because probably the app always wins on presumption because they read the whole 1AC is just presumption arguments, then they golden turn everything out through the PMR. All right, extend. Extend drop the debater. Again, their argument here is that it's more educational to drop the argument. But again, if you drop the argument, you're dropping the entirety of their case because it all depends on utilitarian logic. But like even so, like you need to like allow this shell to be read in future rounds, which means you have to vote it up. That's the only way you can actually deter them from reading util in the future. Also, extend competing in terms of reasonability. They basically concede this when they're arguing against our reasonability standard later. Extend no RBIs. They claim they should get equal access to theory, but insofar as they're being hugely abusive, they should they're easily winning case due to this sort of thing. But also, this encourages theory baiting, which means theory is always a gateway issue, which destroys education. Extend the MG theory is broken. Don't accept it. Yeah, extend the other stuff. All right. Next on the resolution. Sorry. Oh, okay, fine. In response to the IBI, first of all, we don't think it's Nazi ideology. They are using util. That's a turn on the IBI. Again, util justifies no value to life. They're defending the framework that would allow this sort of thing. We're defending structural violence, which acknowledges that some people are hugely harmed by utilitarianism. At best, it's a non-unique. Also, the probability arguments are nonsensical because partly is about quick thinking. Extend the access argument. Access is the internal link to fairness because in order to get any procedural fairness out of the round, we have to first have debaters in it, which means that they make the debate space unsafe according to which. On the ableism points, you can extend those. Next, on the counterinterps, these don't solve. Again, like the education argument doesn't make any sense. We turn, or we're winning in education. The accessibility argument doesn't make sense because, again, we're more, or they're making the debate space an unsafe space because util is inherently ableist and terrible. The arguments against the peeping Tom don't work. With Kantianism, they give no example. Also, like, there's plenty of alternatives. You could read structural violence.
You don't have to say something's better, just that.
Right. You just have to evaluate whether our model of debate is slightly better.
Independent of the theory sheet. You vote us on presumption because there's no way you can.
Right. You vote us on presumption because there's no way you can.
The word should is a moral obligation.
Because the moral, the word should is moral obligation, which then there's a trichotomy between permissibility and obligation and prohibition, which means if we prove one, we disprove the other two. They've dropped this. This is like a definitional issue. If they contest this, then they're contesting grammar, and you can drop them because they don't believe in debate, and like nothing else flows through, which means that this is the only question you can be evaluating on the presumption layer. We're winning on that. Next on the plan. First of all, like the plan is dependent on various things happening. They think that the Taliban has to agree to meet various demands. They read arguments that these demands might be met because the U.S. has leverage. But again, if they're not met in the status quo, it's unlikely they'll be met in the future. And so long as there is a chance that the Taliban doesn't meet these demands, the AF might not happen. Which means that you're voting for an AF that doesn't happen. That's a presumption ballot immediately because they're not affirming the resolution. They're not upholding the resolution. We also define normalize as to recognize as a state, which means they're not being topical and they're not affirming their burden, which is to prove the resolution true. Again, they've conceded the definition of normalized, which means, and they've also conceded that they're not normalized, or that they're not recognizing them as a state, which is an auto drop. Also, like the plan's probably counterflying ground. You can vote neg if you think the plan's good. Next, structural violence. Okay, the argument here, on the third argument, they're claiming that there are more NGOs in their world. Again, we don't think this is true. We read specific arguments about the Vienna Convention, which implies that if you recognize them as a state, or if you allow them more power, like more diplomatic power, they're able to refuse humanitarian aid to be sent without their consent, which means that they control 100% of the humanitarian aid. In our world, some of the humanitarian aid escapes the state's hands, which means that they're able to, or the state doesn't have infinite power over all their citizens' lives. And so they're not able to completely control their agency and this sort of thing. So we're somewhat better because we're preserving some of those parallel structures. Again, their arguments against the parallel structures don't fly through. Again, 22 million people are served every year by the UN and various other countries. On the argument about legitimization, again, they claim they're not recognizing, but insofar as we have a perceptual shift, they're perceived as recognizing statehood for the Taliban. That's dropped. That means that the Taliban feels like they can do more, but also they get more political power, and in other areas like the Vienna Convention. Again, extend the parallel aid. That's the cleanest link to structural violence. In their world, they're reifying the same structures as have existed for years and years, and they're making them permanent because now the Taliban has huge political capital, and they're able to keep oppressing women for on and on. All right, next on counterterrorism. Oh, extend the dropped weigh-in from the 1AC about how structural violence is a prerequisite to any of their other impacts because it's the biggest order of magnitude impact in the round, and it's the only thing we can resolve outside of the round. On the counterterrorism argument, extend martyrdom. Their only response here is it creates a deterrent effect, but that's not true for religious people who believe that there's an afterlife. On their second, so that flows to that eternal defense. On the second,
martyrs are religious leaders.
Yeah, martyrs are religious leaders. All right, second is on the humanitarian access argument. Again, public backlash probably does turn this argument because insofar as the policy gets repealed because the U.S. People in the U.S. don't agree with it, you don't get any long-term solvency, but also you're collapsing parallel structure, which means that you're making all of the humanitarian aid depend on the state, whereas in our world some of the humanitarian aid doesn't depend on the state, so we're net better for whatever the structural violence. On the backlash argument, they claim they get fiat power, but again, if they can fiat that there are no harms to the plan, then we could never win. Again, there always are going to be harms to the plan. They can only fiat the passage of the plan.
I recommend a view sheet for convenience, but everyone can do what they wish. It's going to be theory and then probably case. On theory. In my first speech, I told you to reject all semantical we meets. They don't have an out with their we meet because we're just talking about this round. This round has been skewed procedurally, and our opponents can't talk about some other round and how they met in some other round. That we meet doesn't flow through. Their counter standards also don't work. First, on education, you don't get education insofar as we've already explained to you that philosophical education is the only thing you care about, and the delta here is utilitarianism versus some other framework versus another framework versus another framework. I think that internally creates more philosophical education because we're not just relying on net benefits or utilitarianism or going to that default state that we all default to as debaters. We're actually learning more about the world and learning more about our moral values, so that is the delta there. They don't get access to education. Next, they also have no clean link from utilitarianism to accessibility. And our opponents, I think, mishandle our arguments about accessibility. When you use utilitarianism as a framework, you exclude certain people, like people who experience anhedonia, for instance, from actually engaging in debate in the first place. And accessibility is the internal link into arguments like fairness. They don't have a procedural fairness voter, so we're going in for it now. Extend that accessibility is the internal link to fairness, and they also drop that fairness is a meta constraint on truth, i.e. you can't evaluate any other question besides the fairness question, or you have to evaluate the fairness question first. Insofar as our standards of ableism and moral repugnance flow through, you buy that their way mechanism of utilitarianism skews certain people out of debate because it fundamentally cannot unjustify things like a peeping Tom, which we know is intrinsically bad, but you cannot deny that that's a good thing under a utilitarian framework, which is probably really, really bad, and also turns their IBI that they try to go for about value of life, because when you use utilitarianism, that's fundamentally removing the ability to consider things like agency in your utilitarian calculus, because anything that's not pleasure or pain is just excluded from that moral calculus. So we turn accessibility, they can't go for the IBI in their last speech. Any extrapolation will be completely new and should be struck off your ballot. But there are two independent standards we can also go for here. First, you're obviously looking at the accessibility standard as the two standards linked to accessibility that we articulated from our first speech, because those are internal links to fairness, and you can't truth test any other question. You have to look to fairness first. Our opponents haven't articulated anything to procedural fairness, so you have to look to those two standards first, because the procedural fairness of this round has been skewed and you can't evaluate anything else. But even if you look to bottom layers, we're winning two more standards. Extend laziness. They don't get the turn on philosophical education. Extend that it's util versus some other framework versus some other framework versus some other framework. That's a lot of verses. But at the end of the day, that is more philosophical education. You vote us on a risk of education, which again is what debate is for in the first place. That's portable education and the reason debate gets funded. Third, you can also extend the argument that adjudication is itself a prerequisite. You need to have a definitive conclusion as a judge in order to vote on an argument, and because our opponents, adjudication is fundamentally impossible under utilitarianism for the conceded argument of time constraints or time discounting and other stuff like justifications are inherently circular, then you cannot adjudicate this debate without looking to the theory sheet first. So reject them on case. Extend that should is a moral obligation. Therefore, in order to affirm this round, in order to prove the resolution true, they need to prove a moral obligation to do the thing. But if you can't achieve an objective morality under utilitarianism, then you cannot affirm the resolution, which means you vote negative there. There's a presumption valid. We don't need an alternative framework. The affirmative's burden is to provide the framework with which you evaluate arguments, and utilitarianism fails because of the conceded arguments I said above. Okay, what can they possibly collapse? What?
No RBI.
Also, extend no RBIs on the underview. I think our arguments completely outweigh theirs. They talk about like reciprocity, but they don't implicate this to anything. And I think any implication would be new in the PMR. You have to clean flow through the justification for not voting on an RBI because like RBIs create a chilling effect on legitimate abuse. Would you rather prefer a world where everyone run theory or everyone run abuse? I think it's pretty clear you prefer the former. On their collapse, on their first contention, the turn completely flows through. Martyrs are religious and social leaders, and that leads to more terrorism. This turns their entire contention because when a martyr dies, you feel more invigorated to go against and lash back against the system that hurt you. Next, on backlash, just extend that the U.S. isn't going to send humanitarian aid.
Order's gonna go pretty simple. IDI, then okay. By the time we get 3, 2, when we take the text over spirit, they mention in their MO that spirit over text. Saying text over spirit, it requires intervention. Who's to say what is the spirit of your text? It means that you increase intervention, which means that kills fairness. You say layer fairness first, we tell you that. Because of that, you probably layer fairness first on their argument. We tell you that. They themselves bite this when they say that spirit over text. We tell you that it's important that the text is important, otherwise broad interpretations will lead to people policy violating. For example, if the topic requires util because the resolution states that people will violate their shell, which is probably bad for debate to have broader interpretation. We tell you that outweighs the fitness of the aggressive because of reasons they give us themselves about how we would layer fairness first.
All right,
when we tell you that you go to
I really think this is you.
I think that the spirit of text layer.
Okay, well, first of all, in the LSE, you say reject semantic we needs because we oppose the specific framing of the 1AC, right? And then that's like a spike to the we need. And so this new response, it would lead to that LSE argument, we think.
Okay, I mean, I get that you tagged it in LSE, like you said, like reject semantic meanings, but that's not specifically articulated as a text, as a spirit over text spike. So I think the layering comes out in the MO, so we should get the text over spirit response now.
Panel take their consideration.
On 200 theory, we think that our counter-interpretation should flow through. We think that the counter-interpretation that I'm referring to is the affirmation they set the way mechanism to be that benefits one. We tell you that under their own standard of our counter-standard functions as a turn, that every debate turns into utilitarian framework. That's what they said out of the LSE. We told you that versus response functions as a turn. We told you that we increase accessibility. Accessibility implicates to fairness because you can't even engage in debate if people get up here talking about deontology. You come from a small school and you don't actually know what would actually mean. You never had a coach. We tell you that probably implicates to accessibility, but accessibility is a prerequisite and obviously implicates to fairness for that reason. We tell you that again, this is an outright concern, and we tell you that you layer outright concern over structural violence, as they tell you themselves, because they literally read you an interview about why outright is important, right? So, and you must define the rules of the game before you can actually play. So we tell you that they themselves implicate, that they themselves agree with this, and so we tell you that yeah, that's probably what you're voting on first, except everything outside of IBAs because that is an independent voting issue. Tell you also turn on the philosophical argument on education. The comparative is not utilitarian versus other frameworks versus other frameworks versus other frameworks. It's we are any framework versus any framework versus any framework except utilitarianism versus any framework except utilitarianism. So we tell you that is a key distinction here on education because we think that you're not comparing another framework to another framework. You're comparing any framework to any framework. Okay, great. And then we tell you that the RBIs are actually okay, right? The MO gets up here and they completely concede that RBIs are okay. They try to bring it up again in the LOR, but I'm going to respond to that again. They say that they can essentially it leads them to winning every theory ballot for the winning every theory ballot, and they say that you'd rather have every single person win the theory ballot versus every single person run abusive arguments. We tell you that no, you probably don't because we think that it takes away from all substance if everybody just runs theory every single time. That probably implicates to having absolutely no education in the round. We tell you that having absolutely no education means that people won't even show up in the first place, even if you buy that fairness. Even if you buy that fairness, it's prerequisite to education. We tell you that means that if we win the theory show, then we get access to our RBI, thus we get an offense off the theory. Okay, and extend that it only deters bad theory. Okay, so they misunderstand the IBI and it loses them the ground. Right? They get up here and they say that there are frameworks out there that lead to no value of life. We tell you that they misunderstand the IBI and that itself loses them around. We reject the ideology that one can have no value to life. Of course, we don't affirm that anyone can ever have no value to life. That justifies Nazi ideology and genocide. Also, you can see that presumption flips affirmation because the block is broken in plus interpretation there. But under objectivity over fairness, we think that, again, this is another real issue for the affirmation because we tell you that objectivity is a prerequisite. You cannot be fair without objectivity. Where we tell you that if you don't have objectivity, that also encourages judge intervention, it also kills fairness, and for that reason, objectivity is a prerequisite to fairness. And then they also can see that utilitarianism is the most objective framework because it's a calculus, and for that reason, it's probably an independent voter in there as well. Okay, so under this independent voter of nihilism as a whole, we think that. Okay, then we'll move on to case. We think that probably the cleanest voter for the affirmation on case is the humanitarian access. They tell you a term, they tell you that the backbone leads to that there's going to be backlash, there's no humanitarian. And again, I want to point out how in our plan we don't actually ever validate the Taliban as a actual government. All we do is increase like food insecurity, increase women's rights because we are the only path that actually increases diplomatic relations. We tell you that the incentive analysis that we give you goes largely conceded about how if you ever do actually get down to case, we tell you that the incentive analysis that we give you about how they are very likely to increase humanitarian benefits because the U.S. literally has $7 billion of their GDP. In their banking system probably means that there's a significant leverage over the Taliban, and for that reason, they're probably going to have to invent. Yeah, and for that reason, they're probably going to prevent economic collapse, and then because of that, they're going to adhere to the ban that the U.S. has, for example, increasing and reducing Al-Qaeda's active operations, which probably means that there's less human rights violations. And then back on to. We'll also trivialize economic collapse as harming the quality of life of all individuals. We think that economic collapse probably leads to a lot of death and dehumanization because people can't even be themselves in the first place. We also think that under accessibility and under agency, we told you that.
Good round, guys.
Thank you.